Hey everybody, welcome to the very first episode of Financial Foundations, right here in good old Rutland, Vermont. This is your monthly market roundup. I'm Dom, this is Steve. We're two local fiduciary financial planners with Green Hill Financial Partners. We're here to help break down what's been happening in the news.
And each month we'll cover financial headlines, explain what they mean, and connect the dots to real-life situations like budgeting, retirement planning, and managing your everyday expenses. We'll also dive into key financial concepts that keep showing up in the news, so you're not left guessing.
And before we wrap, we'll share a few local events in the community focused on financial education and community connection. This month, we're looking at the stretch of March through April. Interest rates held steady, the job market kept growing, inflation crept up, and tariffs made headlines again.
And we'll explore how those tariffs are meant to boost U.S. manufacturing and why our trade relationships make this more layered conversation than it initially appears. Let's jump in.
All right, so this is our first segment. We're going to dig into three major financial headlines from the past months. We're going to start with interest rates. Steve's going to check on the job market, and I'll wrap up with inflation, because all three are still shaping the economy and our everyday decisions. First up, interest rates. At its April meeting, the Fed decided to hold the rate steady. This marks the sixth straight meeting with no change and signals that the Fed is really sticking to a cautious wait-and-see approach. What's the reasoning behind that decision? Well, even though inflation's cooled off, it's not where they want it to be. And recent headlines around tariffs and trade tensions haven't exactly helped settle that outlook. So what does this mean for us in practical terms? Well, if you're carrying credit card debt, looking at a mortgage, or thinking about financing a new car, rates are still pretty high. Even small changes can impact long-term borrowing costs. So this environment calls for extra attention to debt management. Here in Vermont, this could look like home buyers in Rutland or Middlebury rethinking their budgets, postponing the purchase, or it could also look like seasonal workers carrying higher credit card balances after a long winter. On the flip side, savers are still benefiting. Some savings accounts and CDs are offering around 4% interest right now. If your local bank or credit union isn't keeping up, it could be time to shop around. But whether you're borrowing or saving, the key takeaway is this. Just because those rates are on pause doesn't mean your planning should be. Now's the time to tighten spending and make your budget work smarter, not harder.
All right, let's take a look at the job market. There's still a lot of strength here. And the March report showed the U.S. added some good, strong jobs at 300,000, with major gains in healthcare, hospitality, and construction. While unemployment did tick down and labor force participation is holding up, it's great news for workers, but many employers here in Vermont are still struggling with finding staff for the upcoming season. From builders here in Killington to long-term care centers in Barrie, businesses were raising wages and offering better benefits to attract and retain talent. But there's a flip side here. Higher wages can mean higher expenses, and those get passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices. And that's what keeps inflation sticky and why the Fed is hesitant to declare victory over inflation just yet. But still, a strong job market generally supports the broader economy. People with stable jobs and rising incomes are more likely to spend, save, and even invest. So the labor market's a bright spot, but one that comes with trade-offs policymakers have to carefully weigh.
Heck yeah, buddy. Thank you for that. Now we're going to talk a little bit about inflation. So April's data showed a slight increase with the annual inflation rate, which is up from the previous month. It wasn't a massive increase, but it was enough to throw cold water on any hopes of those near-term rate cuts. What's the driving force there? Housing and fuel prices remain the biggest contributors. But even core inflation, that's the inflation you get out when you strip the volatile categories, was higher than expected. And this is suggesting that inflation isn't coming from one or two areas, it's a bit more embedded in everything. And here's where that hits home. Groceries, gas, rent, the stuff we pay for every week. A small percent increase might not sound like much, but when it's across the board, it adds up fast, and it can put a lot of strain on already strained budgets.
Yeah, Dom, we've all probably seen the cost of a dozen eggs lately, It's been a hot topic in the news since late 2024, and it's starting to feel like you're shopping in the luxury goods aisle.
Right? At this rate, I'm thinking about financing my omelets. I mean, you've got Denny's upcharging for every single egg you buy, and I even see DoorDash is offering payment plans for your delivery. I feel like a deal maker every time I buy myself an egg sandwich. But in all seriousness, these are the reasons why the Fed is taking their time. They want to see consistent progress before making any big moves. Their focus is to avoid stagflation, which is a harder situation for a country to break out of. But what does that mean for the rest of us? Well, it's a great reminder to review our budgets. We should look for ways we can cut costs and remove unnecessary spending. And we should plan debt with flexibility in mind.
So to sum it up, the Fed is holding interest rates steady for now. The job market's still tight, but inflation isn't done with us yet. It's not all bad news, but definitely a moment to stay sharp. And we know when the headlines are this mixed, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So staying grounded and focused on your long-term plan and avoiding letting your emotions drive your decisions is really important in these uncertain times.
That's perfect advice, Steve. Now we're going to take a step back and look at how the markets are responding to those big updates. Early March felt pretty steady. Stocks were up, confidence was high. It was very much business as usual, but it didn't last. Tariff talks came and volatility picked up as fast as a blizzard in the winter, especially in sectors like manufacturing and retail.
Yeah, and those sectors matter here in Vermont. Small businesses in towns like Bennington and Brattleboro that rely on the global supply chain are especially sensitive. Higher costs from tariffs can delay hiring, stall projects, and often force price hikes. It's the same for local retailers in places like downtown Rutland or Burlington. When uncertainty hits, they might hold off on expansion or investments in inventory.
Definitely. And Steve, we also saw a dip in the 10-year Treasury yield, which is a classic sign that investors are nervous. Bonds kind of act like a financial mood ring. When the yield falls, it usually means folks are shifting to more safer investments. The whole situation is kind of like when you take your snow tires off in April, only to get that big snowstorm the next day, and you're either stuck in the driveway or you're going to be sliding all over the road.
And as much as I love skiing, I think all of us in Vermont, most of us anyway, may be looking forward to summer and warmer weather. And bonds, they don't like surprises either, and neither do Vermonters when the weather flips. So the bigger theme here is uncertainty. Consumers are still spending and businesses are still hiring, but just like the spring weather around here, everybody's keeping an eye on what's coming next.
For sure. So while volatility might sound like a Wall Street problem, it absolutely shows up in our local economy. It shows up in our payrolls, in our pricing, and how our businesses make those decisions.
And that's why it's important to stay grounded. The common theme here is don't panic over the headlines, stick to your long-term plan, and make adjustments only when it makes sense for you and your plan.
Exactly, Steve. And moving on to the next segment we call this the Concept Corner. This is where we take topics that are really popular in news stories and break those down in an easy to understand way. So this month, we're going to be talking about trade deficits and tariffs. They might sound like things only policy analysts care about, but they have very real effects on what we pay for at the store, how our local businesses operate, and where jobs are created or lost. So starting with tariffs. A tariff is essentially a tax on an imported good. So if the U.S. puts a 15% tariff on steel, a Vermont manufacturer importing that steel now has to pay 15% more just to get it in the door.
Yeah, Dom, and from what I'm hearing from folks around the community, they assume that tariffs are meant to punish other countries, but more often than not, they raise costs for us here in the U.S. For businesses and consumers in the short term. It's like when the price of canning jars goes up during syrup season. The price goes up not because of the syrup, but because those glass jars come from overseas.
Or imagine a sugar tariff is suddenly placed and maple candy is twice as expensive now. That cost is going to get passed directly to the customer, whether we're in Montpelier or Manchester. But the goal of the tariffs are to make American-made products more competitive. If the imports get more expensive, maybe those local goods start to win out. But there's a challenge with that. Almost everything we make here in the US relies on materials or parts from somewhere else. For example, we have a Vermont woodworker who makes furniture. They might source their bolts or finishes from another country. Tariffs on those supplies will increase the production cost for the woodmaker. So even though the final piece is proudly made in Vermont, it's still been impacted by those tariffs.
All right, Tom, thanks for that. Let's take a look at the other side of the coin here, which is trade deficits. Now, that's when we import more than we export as a country. So buying more from other countries than we're selling to them. It may sound bad, but it isn't always. Sometimes a trade deficit just means that Americans have money to spend and we're buying stuff. But too much dependence on imports can leave us exposed to the global supply chain and disruptions like we saw during COVID. Many of you may remember when the ports were getting backed up across the globe, causing shortages in products, delays, and price increases right here in America.
You know, I think that's a really, really important point there, Steve, that I don't want to gloss over. So trade deficits don't necessarily indicate a negative in a country. They can indicate a positive, like their economy is booming. So much so that domestic production can't keep up with that demand. Or maybe its citizens have so much money they choose to purchase things outside of the country. On the same hand, though, they can be an indication of negative things. They can indicate an over-reliance on those imported goods, and that's why policymakers get so weary when we're talking about trade deficits. And that's why they introduce those tariffs. It's to shrink that trade gap. But again, it's a double-edged sword. They might protect one industry, like domestic aluminum, but they could end up hurting another, like breweries or bike shops that need those materials from outside the country.
That's a good example. Let's take Vermont Bike and Brew, and let's say they suddenly paid more for aluminum frames. You better believe that that next bike is going to cost you more.
The other option is that they could switch suppliers. That in and of itself might not be good enough. It could have an impact to the quality and still impact price. Either way, that local business and us as customers are going to feel it. So while the headlines might seem distant, they do hit close to home. Whether you're a contractor in Brandon, a retailer in St. Albans, or a farmer in Addison County, tariffs and trade policy directly affect your cost and your options.
And on the bottom line, tariffs and trade deficits, they're not just academic terms, they shape our national and our local economy. And we better understand how they work, and that'll allow us to be prepared, as the changes come.
Definitely, definitely. And moving on to our next segment, this is where we take a deeper dive into some of those ideas and expand on them. And specifically, we want to talk about why tariffs are making that comeback. The main reason from the administration is that it's about rebuilding domestic manufacturing, bringing all those outsourced jobs overseas back to America, securing national supply chains versus global supply chains, and reducing that dependence on foreign goods. The idea here is simple. If it costs more to import something, maybe those companies who are making them overseas will start moving back to us to make them here. In theory, that's going to boost local jobs and it's going to strengthen our national resilience.
Yeah, on paper, that sounds like a win for American workers, Dom. But manufacturing today is more global. So, like you said before, even a product that says made in the USA might have parts from 5 different countries. So when tariffs are applied to raw materials like semiconductors, machinery parts, or materials, it doesn't just impact the producers overseas. It directly increases costs for the US manufacturer, and smaller companies like the ones we see in our own backyard, they usually can't absorb those increased costs. So again, they might delay expansion, postpone hiring, and most likely they're going to rise prices.
I experienced that for myself, that price increase last week. I'm a man of habit. I found some shoes very comfortable. They were perfect for work and home. So I went to go purchase another pair because I had worn them out. But that same pair of shoes was more than 2 times as expensive as it was before. And so ultimately, I decided on getting a different pair of shoes. But that's where we're going to see it. We're going to see it in the details. There could be longer wait times for parts. There could be fewer job listings, or like I experienced, an increase on prices for those local goods. And that's how policy from Washington shows up in Windsor, in Rutland, and Montpelier. A great example of this for Rutland is GE. So even though they've made significant local investments on their infrastructure and supply chains, they still rely very heavily on a complex global supply chain, which, if disrupted, could have major impact on their employees, which could be our friends, our family, our neighbors, maybe even some of us watching this today.
Yeah. And that's why we highlight this stuff, Dom. We're not here to take sides. We're here to explain how this works and how these ripple effects impact our community, so you can adapt your financial plan with clarity and confidence. So let's pivot to what's happening locally, because here financial literacy starts with community conversations. So on May 28th at noon, we're hosting a free seminar at the Hub Coworks in Rutland. It's called Politics, Panic, and Portfolios. Is your portfolio built to last? During this session, we'll break down how to stay steady when the news cycle gets loud. No sales, just strategy and support.
I love those events, Steve. We're also partnering with a few other community institutions for what we're calling table talk sessions. So we're going to have the first on May 5th at 11:30 a.m. at the Godnick Adult Center. And the second one is going to be May 22nd at 11 a.m., and that's at the Young at Heart Senior Center in Poultney. I recently got the chance to host one of these sessions in Bennington, and it was an incredible experience. Just being there as a resource and a sounding board for the community members is so rewarding. These are open door sessions. There's no pressure. It's just a conversation. It can be one-on-one or in a group, and you just bring whatever's weighing on your mind, whether it's how tariffs might affect retirement, how to keep up with rising prices, or concerns about the future of Social Security. We're there to answer those questions for you.
And if you want more information or want to sign up, you can reach out to the hosting centers or check with PEG TV. We'd love to see you there, because whether it's one-on-one or on air, we're here to help you feel confident, not just in your portfolio, but in your everyday financial life. So next month, we look forward to exploring seasonal market trends, how spring and summer typically affect investments, and what that means for you. If you have a question or a topic you want us to cover, just let us know. This show is for you.
And that wraps up our April roundup. Thank you very much for joining us for our first ever episode of Financial Foundations. We've covered interest rates, job markets, inflation, and tariffs, all things that impact our wallets in one way or another. Our goal here is to cut through the noise and make these topics feel less overwhelming, so people can better understand how things like policy changes or market shifts actually impact their day-to-day lives. So until next time, take care of yourselves and take care of your neighbors. I'm Dom Stilwell.
And I'm Steve Morneau. We'll see you next time on Financial Foundations.